Coming up on the Threat Status podcast, we talk to longtime intelligence official Daniel Hoffman about the failure of U.S. deterrence, the threat from ISIS-K, and the future of the Russia-Ukraine war. And then we'll dive into the Israel-Iran conflict and talk about foreign influence operations inside the United States. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I am joined, as always, here by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, national security editor here at the Times. And you may notice, of course, that we are arriving on your smartphones or on your computers on a Friday morning now instead of a Monday morning. So hopefully that adjustment won't be too jarring for all of you. But Guy, welcome to Threat Status on a Friday morning. What's on your radar right now?
Ben, great to be here, as always. One thing that's caught me in the last few days is that the Ukraine war is shifting into a dangerous new phase in which Russia seems to be solidifying its control of occupied eastern Ukraine. Russian missiles pounded the northern Ukrainian city of Chernihiv this week. Moscow now says it downed 5 Ukrainian military balloons in what has largely become a war of attrition, all while uncertainty continues to swirl in Washington over whether or not Congress will come through with new U.S. aid. Another one this week that deserves a close look is the way that U.S. tech giant Microsoft has emerged as a central player in what I like to describe as the great power AI war, or the U.S.-China Cold War over the future of global technology dominance. Microsoft announced this week that it will invest $1.5 billion in a United Arab Emirates firm called G42, really the leading UAE AI firm. This was a deal that appears to have been orchestrated by the Biden administration, which has been trying through other mechanisms to blacklist China from the most advanced AI microchips or semiconductor chips, mainly through sanctions on Chinese companies that make weapons and want those chips for things like theoretical drone swarms, where the computer brains of drones can make group decisions without humans in the loop, so to speak. G42, prior to the Microsoft investment, had a history of using Chinese tech, things like Huawei tech. This potentially meant China was getting a front row spy seat into the most advanced work being done on AI by one of the most advanced tech companies in the Middle East. Now, as a condition of Microsoft investing $1.5 billion in G42, that Chinese position will be dramatically cut down. Specifically, Microsoft is reportedly requiring that G42 strip all Chinese gear out of its own tech operations, including equipment from Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant.
It's going to be fascinating to see if that trend continues, and if you see other companies essentially trying to push back on what was feared to be Chinese dominance in a lot of these high-tech areas. Guy, we need to talk about Iran and Israel, and of course, by now everybody knows the details of the strike last Saturday, or the attempted strike, I should say, by Iran against Israel. That, of course, was Iran's retaliation, it said, for an April 1st strike believed to be carried out by Israel on a portion of the Iranian diplomatic complex in Damascus, Syria. Now, about 99% of the Iranian munitions were shot down by the Israelis, the Americans, even the Jordanians, and Israel suffered very little damage and only one reported injury. So that was good. But it's left us in an interesting geopolitical place, and the circumstances are different, Guy, but in some ways it reminds me of that period in January 2020 after the U.S. killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, and it looked like both nations were sort of on an irreversible collision course to war, even though it was clear that Donald Trump at the time, the president, didn't want a full-blown war, and Iran didn't either. But both sides needed to save face. Neither could be seen as backing down or looking weak. And we're kind of in a similar spot, I think, now with Iran and Israel as Israel weighs its response. It's a very fluid situation. But another aspect to this that's fascinated me over the past couple of days is the position of the Biden administration with respect to Israel and the Netanyahu government. Look, the U.S. has spent weeks, months, I guess, really at this point, publicly lecturing Israel about how it's prosecuting the war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip. We even threatened, we remember John Kirby at the White House podium threatening wholesale changes to U.S. policy toward Israel if the civilian death toll, didn't dramatically turn around. Now we're essentially, in some ways, trying to prescribe to them how to respond to the Iranian attack. Don't do anything to escalate. Keep this under control. Biden told Netanyahu reportedly, quote, take the win. So we need to underline here, of course, and I know you'll talk about this a little bit more, Guy, that the U.S. military did help the Israelis shoot down all of these Iranian missiles and drones. So in that sense, America put its money where its mouth was when it comes to being a reliable security partner for Israel in the face of these kind of attacks. But I think the phrase "it's complicated" could probably sum up the Biden administration's relationship with Israel right now. And for Jerusalem, I do wonder if there's sort of a trade-off possibility here. Look, maybe we don't escalate against Iran. Maybe we hit the Houthis or some other kind of retaliation. But in return, you, the U.S., get off of our backs and let us get into Rafah and finally finish off Hamas once and for all. So all those dynamics are kind of at play. And another one that's at play here, Guy, and this didn't get as much attention as the U.S. and Israel's role in all this, but Jordan, of course, also helped shoot down a lot of those Iranian, or at least some of those Iranian munitions that flew over its territory. That was noteworthy because Iraq didn't. They were flying over Iraqi territory as well, reportedly some over Lebanon, Syria as well. Of course, they didn't either. Jordan did, and I'm curious what that sort of says to you about broader Middle East dynamics, that Jordan was willing to do that in a very tense moment last Saturday.
You put a lot out there, Ben. Let me try to unpack it. I mean, the first thing is I do think the Israel Defense Forces are testing Iran's red lines by carrying out strikes away from Gaza. And the April 1 strike on the Iranian consulate in Damascus was a perfect example of that. It's almost as if Israel wants to take world attention away from the Gaza war and maybe calculated that strike would anger Iran so much that Iran would have to do something that showed its military aggression to the rest of the region, right? And the question now is whether what had been this movement of Arab-Israeli security coordination that the United States was trying to stand up between Gulf Arab powers like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and Jordan was part of that as well, prior to October 7, that movement that really broke down after October 7 because pan-Arab anger over the manner in which Israeli strikes in Gaza have killed many innocent Palestinians. This question is, does this new dynamic of escalation between Iran and Israel bring that Arab-Israel coalition back together? I'm talking about the prospect of Saudi-Israeli security coordination against Iran. Because remember, Iran is the main Shiite Muslim rival to the predominantly Sunni Muslim kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The big question is, are we at this new inflection point in Mideast power? Are things about to shift, or are they shifting before our eyes again right now?
I wonder if Iran, have they kind of overplayed their hand? Because depending on how you look at this, okay, are the Iranians directly or indirectly responsible for major disruptions to global shipping that we talked about with Norman Rule last week? Are they essentially responsible if Israel-Hezbollah, expands into a major war in Lebanon? Now they're responsible for this potential, this attack on Israel that could lead to a conflagration in the region. So you've got, Iran kind of got its hands in a lot of different pots here with respect to conflicts in the Middle East. And I do wonder how that's going to play. We'll get into a lot of that coming up here with our guest, Guy.
Our feature interview, Ben, with Daniel Hoffman. As some listeners will know, Dan is a retired CIA clandestine services officer. When he worked for the CIA, he held station chief positions, including at one time in Moscow. Dan is one of the most informed and clear-thinking global conflict and intelligence experts that I know, and he's actually a contributor to Threat Status, as he writes a regular opinion column for the Washington Times. Dan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. Here's where I want to start. Given your experience serving in the intelligence community in a past life, do you think that CIA Director William Burns is doing a good job right now? He's been running all over the Middle East in recent months, really trying to get a ceasefire in Gaza. And now it looks like it's kind of blowing up in his face. What's your take on that?
Look, I don't think he has all the control over whether a ceasefire actually does take place, but I will tell you that I think he is doing a great job. He's the right guy for the job, having been ambassador to Russia as well as to Jordan. Look, the CIA mission, it's recruit spies, steal secrets, and deliver the best analysis you can to the president so that we can detect threats way out left of boom and then preempt them before they're visited upon our shores. But he's been asked to do so much more. If you look at the geopolitical challenges we face, more wickedly challenging now than ever before, with a war raging in Gaza, Iran is at war with Israel. Forget about the shadow war. That's over. When you launch 300 combined cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and drones at Israel, that's warfare. And Israel will respond. I know we'll get to that later, but you've got that. You've got North Korea, China, massive threats there, deliberately flooding our country with fentanyl. Every one of these challenges we face in foreign policy has an intelligence component, because that new axis of tyranny I've written about in Washington Times op-eds, Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea, those are all dictatorships, and they're opaque. At least we got a fighting chance if we're doing a good job on the intel front.
Well, speaking of Bill Burns, of course, we've all seen now the Situation Room photos from last Saturday while Iran was attacking Israel. President Biden huddled with his national security team. Dan, I'm just curious, because of your long and deep career in the IC, can you walk us through sort of what's happening at the ground level when something like an actual Iranian attack on Israel is playing out? What are the conversations like between U.S. and Israeli officials, for example?
Well, there's a lot going on simultaneously when something like that's happening. There was a lot that happened beforehand. So we had a lot of warning that Iran was going to launch this massive attack. And there's a lot of diplomatic efforts engaging with our Sunni Gulf partner allies to have access to their airspace, and Jordan shooting down drones in their airspace, trying to gain intelligence collection, reflections on what's going on in Iran, and what other attacks they might be launching, and then focus on Lebanese Hezbollah and the Houthis and Iran's proxy terrorists in Iraq, and the extent to which they might be taking advantage of the situation. There's a war going on between Israel and Hezbollah right now, too. Hezbollah is launching regular rocket attacks on Israel. It's not the full Monty of 100,000 plus rockets at once, which would bring a full-scale war, but they've wounded and killed Israeli soldiers, and Israelis have targeted Hezbollah terrorists as well.
And it's like there's an escalation there this week that's not getting as much attention.
Absolutely. Deterrence, there is no more deterrence. Russia's attack on Ukraine demonstrated we didn't deter Russia there. Israel, we collectively did not deter Hamas from launching what was an unprecedented, massive attack, brazen attack on Israeli innocent civilians. Nor did we deter Iran, even though President Biden said, don't do it. They did it. That's the other challenge for the intelligence community, is deterrence is failing right now. So where's the next attack coming from? And it's likely coming from Israel.
All right, but let's go out. Let's fly up to 80,000 feet. And I don't want this necessarily to be, let's put intelligence over ideology, but I want to hear Dan Hoffman, the geopolitical analyst. Do America's adversaries fear the U.S. anymore? We knew the Russian invasion. You brought up deterrence and the failure of deterrence. We knew the Russian invasion was coming in Ukraine. We seem to have known the Iran attack on Israel was coming. We've known years in advance that there could be a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Why aren't we able to stop any of these events at this point?
So if you and I remember from our New England college poli-sci classes when we were kids, what deterrence means. It means that your adversary is not going to strike you because they fear that you will strike them even harder. It will be worse for them. We've lost that, 100% lost it. And we lost it repeatedly. I think our adversaries are reading the tea leaves. If you look at Ukraine, what was our overriding strategy? Well, I don't really know. As long as it takes is a terrible strategy. It harkens back to these so-called forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, where it was unclear where we were headed. But the other piece of it was from President Biden is don't escalate. That's always been his message. Don't escalate. Don't make this a larger conflict. When you talk about that being your preeminent goal, then the adversaries don't fear you because they know that you don't want the one thing that is going to prevent them from attacking you. Iran has to fear, which they don't, by the way, they had to have feared that if they launched on Israel, we would destroy their regime. But we didn't. And so they did. And if you're wondering, what are the ramifications of this Iranian attack? They are way beyond the Middle East because Iran has demonstrated that we value no escalation over real deterrence. That's my concern. This harkens back to the 1930s. It's a slippery slope to appeasement. I'll bet you that Bill Burns is collecting intelligence on exactly how our adversaries see the United States and delivering it to the White House. You got to tell your leader, the director of CIA or the president of the United States, what the president needs to know, and it's not what he wants to hear. I hope they're course correcting based on the intelligence we're getting, because the fear of escalation is causing us to have no deterrence.
Well, speaking of Russia and Ukraine, I want to run something by here, Dan. You may probably saw it. Deputy Secretary of State Kirk Campbell a couple of weeks ago said the U.S. estimates now that Russia has almost fully reconstituted its military back to where they were sort of pre-February 2022. How have they done that? And what do you think it means for Ukraine's chances the longer this war drags on?
So first of all, you got to be super careful about saying that they reconstituted their military. They've had 400,000 reportedly casualties. So you're bringing in new people, new conscripts. They're not known for really good training or logistics.
So lower quality personnel, less training.
That's the question I'd be asking our military analysts at CIA and DIA is tell me about the quality of these guys. Because the one thing, if you talk to the Ukrainians, and I've talked to some of my former colleagues who just visited Ukraine, is that they are killing countless numbers of Russian military soldiers. The Russians just keep throwing them out there to get killed. Quality of the conscripts is one thing. They are obviously reliant on North Korea for artillery and Iran for drones, but they are building out their own defense industrial base. Putin is going to be talking a lot about this because he wants us to believe in this country that it's an unwinnable war, when in fact, I would argue at least, that Ukraine is winning. And Putin doesn't want to negotiate. He wants Kyiv. He wants to topple the government there, and he wants to own it. He wants to make it a part of the Russian Empire.
We're very focused here in this conversation on great power competition, great power alliances, axes of authoritarian power. If we were to go back 20 years, we were so focused, the United States intelligence community, just having shifted after the Cold War, was so focused on the threat of global jihadist terrorism and Al-Qaeda. There was a whole narrative in the early 2000s or by 2015, 2016 that the U.S. intelligence community had almost missed the rise of revanchist Russia or miscalculated the rise of China. Now here we are in this, and I'm bringing it up because one of the things we've been identifying in threat status in the last month or two is that ISIS-K is like this resurgent Islamic State branch that has Iran as its enemy, has Russia as its enemy. What are your thoughts on ISIS-K and the prospect of a resurgence of the non-state actor threat?
So let me start with the "we missed it" part of the story. We didn't miss it. I was working Russia. Policy missed it. I don't know how many times I told the White House about the threat from Russia, and I told them about the threat from Russia in a variety of different contexts. When I was running the CIA's Near East division, I had a very pointed discussion with John Brennan about Russia's nefarious role in the Middle East, and he was mad at me and called me a Cold War guy. Okay, I'm sorry I told you something you need to know. You didn't want to hear it, but I'm just saying I know a little about Russia, having lived there for many years. Terrorism's never gone away, and it's not going to go away because we're dealing with failed states. Afghanistan, terrorists enjoy the same open field running they did before 9/11. And there's no such thing as over the horizon. We've talked about that a lot. That's just something you can't see anyways. We don't have the capability to kill those guys, let alone find and fix their locations.
I remember former General John Allen, when he was the chief of the Obama administration's counter-ISIS coalition in the 2017 timeframe, actually telling 2016 timeframe, telling me, and we did it in a story, that the United States political community and intelligence community needed to be prepared for a 50-year arc of Al-Qaeda or groups, spin-off groups like it, a 50-year arc.
Forget 50 years, man. This is forever. When you're dealing with failed states and a population that's vulnerable to being recruited and exploited, I'm sorry, we got to be out on the front lines, as Charles Krauthammer used to like to say, forward defense. Find, fix, and finish your terrorist targets out there. so they don't hurt us here. And so I'm sorry we have to do that. We have to be smart about how we do it, use our alliances, and not try to do things we shouldn't, like build girls' schools and bring democracy to Afghanistan, God forbid. But we should be killing Al Qaeda guys. That's a mission we can't ever let go of.
So I'm sure that Charles Krautheimer would be very interested in this next piece of this, because I want to get to the ISIS-K part, right? In pulling out of Afghanistan, in pulling U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, the Biden administration repeatedly told us and told Congress, told the American people that the U.S. military would have no problem retaining an over-the-horizon intel gathering and strike capability against Islamic State elements and Al-Qaeda elements inside Afghanistan, in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. And yet here we are, where Pentagon commanders are found warning Congress in testimony in recent weeks that actually ISIS-K has got this capability now out of Afghanistan to do external attacks. So do we have a total policy failure there?
100%. Again, there's no such thing as over the horizon. You can't see it. That's an awful, very intellectually dishonest way to describe our strategy. By virtue of the fact that ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda were there in Afghanistan, the hard message from President Biden would have been to say, look, we're going to keep 2,500 troops in Bagram Air Base, and we're going to continue to have an intelligence capability to find, fix, and finish targets. I'm sorry we have to do it, but that's the way we do it. But we didn't. And the situation's only gotten more dire. And we don't have the capability we once had. And the attack in Moscow ought to be a wake-up call for Europe and the United States that they're coming after us and Iran, as you said. We're all in the crosshairs, but we don't have the capability any longer to do what we need to do against them. The price we're going to pay is way more than what we would have paid by having 2,500 troops in Bagram.
Dan, this is a great note to end on. And I'm curious, do you think it's possible Putin knew the ISIS-K attack in Moscow was coming? I mean, we issued a public warning that terrorists were going to attack a concert 2 weeks before. Was this just a spectacular failure by Russian security forces then?
I think they would have, yeah, in past is prologue. I've been involved in this sort of stuff for a while before I retired, and Russia tries to stop every terrorist attack. They really do. It doesn't make Vladimir Putin look very good. It kind of bursts the bubble of his Potemkin village that he could protect the home, his capital city from a terrorist attack. That's a bad look for the dictator. So no, he would have tried to stop it. I'm quite sure they did try to stop it, but it's super hard to do that. And sometimes it's like looking for a needle in a stack of needles. And that's why the other challenge they face that we don't in our country, we say, see something, say something. Well, our people trust state, local, and federal law enforcement. The FBI relies on tips from our alert citizens. There's none of that in Russia. Talk to the FSB. Are you kidding me? They'll throw me in jail because, I was criticizing the war in Ukraine or donated $20 to somebody who wound up helping a Ukrainian NGO, whatever. So there's none of that trust. They are spread thin. The other point is that their intelligence is focused on the war in Ukraine. We talked at the beginning about the opportunity cost of doing one thing, not being able to do something else. Federal Security Service is responsible for collecting intelligence on Ukraine, that massive intel failure there.
Dan Hoffman, we will, I hate to cut it short, but we will have you back. I promise. Thank you so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
My pleasure.
And it's now time for Threats of the Week. This is a weekly segment where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it is here domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is threatening you, the listeners, the American public right now. And Guy, my threat of the week is foreign influence operations inside the United States of America. We don't have time here to rehash the history, of course, of Russia's efforts to use social media to meddle in American elections. It's been going on for well over a decade. But there's some other instances here that maybe should get more attention. Our colleague Ryan Lovelace had a report in the Washington Times this week about a suspected Iranian influence agent who's still working inside the Pentagon. The Defense Department, of course, denies those allegations. You can read more details about that at WashingtonTimes.com. I'll include a link to Ryan's story in the podcast description below. We've also talked on the show about the wildly popular app TikTok, owned by the Chinese parent company ByteDance, which critics say essentially gives the Chinese Communist Party access to Americans' data. They can choose what content they want to amplify, for example, and that can really impact American opinions, particularly among children and teenagers in some, sometimes obvious, but sometimes pretty subtle ways. Our colleague Bill Gertz, who was just on Threat Status a few weeks ago, covered a House Oversight Committee hearing this week that detailed the extent of what House Republicans called large-scale political warfare and influence efforts across the U.S., all kinds of different ways, including economic warfare using trade and commerce to try and destroy U.S. manufacturing and commercial sectors. And Bill Gertz even cites potential chemical warfare through fentanyl exports that can, of course, degrade America in a variety of ways. So look, our focus is rightfully on the kinetic war, the hot conflicts, if you will, between Israel and Iran, certainly Ukraine and Russia. But Guy, influence operations, psychological warfare from America's enemies are a threat right now because we often don't even really know they're happening until it's almost too late.
Well, Ben, that is pretty interesting. Actually, you mentioned that oversight hearing on Chinese political and influence warfare against the United States from this past week. At that hearing, Rep. James Comer, the chairman of the House Oversight and Accountability Committee, he had these really harsh words, and we highlight that in the Threat Status newsletter. He said the Oversight Committee's message to U.S. federal agencies is this: the threat from the Chinese Communist Party is grave, and you must step up and recognize what the Chinese Communist Party is seeking to do to our country. If agencies don't see that the CCP is our adversary, they can't effectively counter China when it targets the American communities for whom the federal government is responsible. There are a whole bunch of other things that Comer said that were pretty eye-opening as well, Ben. So I think you're on the money with yours. My threat of the week is a little bit different. I'm going to go to the Middle East. While there's great concern about a spiraling escalation, a possible direct war between Iran and Israel, I actually want to focus on the more precise threat that the Israel-Hamas war is about to turn into an Israel-Hezbollah war. Hezbollah is the Iran-backed militant group based in Lebanon, just north of Israel, and it's much stronger than the other Iranian proxies, including Hamas. And while global media attention is focused on the prospect of a direct Iran-Israel clash, Israel struck inside Lebanon on April 16, killing 2 high-level Hezbollah commanders, and Hezbollah then carried out a drone strike inside Israel on April 17 that killed 14 Israeli soldiers. Israel and Hezbollah have had a slow churn of back and forth clashes since Hamas attacked Israel in October, but this week looks different to me. My threat of the week is the prospect of a sudden spiral in which a major war breaks out between Hezbollah and Israel, spilling into Lebanon and potentially into Syria.
It's the ring of fire that Israel's always worried about, right? That all of a sudden one day you have Iran itself, the Houthis from the Yemen side, Lebanon to the north, Hamas and Gaza, etc., all turn all of their fire at once on Israel, and that's sort of the doomsday scenario. But you're right, the clash with Lebanon seems to be heating up. Thank you so much, Guy. That's a great threat of the week, and thank you all so much for listening. Thank you so much to Daniel Hoffman for joining the Threat Status podcast this week. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and we will see you all again next week.